I watched my uncle's house burn down and couldn't help but smile. The dark secrets of my family had led to payback. A forgotten book spilled the truth about them, and in the end, they got theirs. Growing up, I always knew I didn't belong, not in the way my half-brother did. He was the golden child, a title handed to him not by effort or virtue but by mere existence. Our father doted on him as if he were the center of the universe. Birthdays. His were grand productions with clowns, bouncy castles, and catered meals. Mine. A quiet dinner where I blew out candles alone. It was as though I was the shadow of the family, a faint outline of something they barely noticed. I remember one summer, my father took my brother on a fishing trip to a private lake. I stayed home, mowing the lawn and cleaning out the garage. The favoritism wasn't subtle, it was glaring, blatant, and soul-crushing. But by then, I had learned to swallow the bitterness. I'd tell myself it didn't matter, that I could carve my own path without their approval. And then there was the wedding, the pinnacle of my brother's charmed life. My father spared no expense, lavishing him and his bride with a ceremony so opulent it could have made royalty envious. A string quartet played under cascading chandeliers, while a fleet of servers ensured champagne glasses were never empty. Guests dressed in designer clothes mingled as if they were in some exclusive society. As I sat at a table far in the back, it became clear where I stood. No acknowledgement, no toast, not even a passing glance. Just the ever-present reminder that I was merely an extra in their perfectly curated family narrative. But as I sipped my watered-down drink, I overheard a conversation that froze me in place. A hushed exchange about an affair, my brother's affair. My ears burned as I realized the other party wasn't a stranger, it was someone painfully close to our family. I didn't know what to do at first. It felt like holding a live grenade, the weight of the revelation trembling in my hands. Should I confront him, tell my father, or maybe let it go and continue fading into the background? But as the night wore on, a darker thought took root. Why let it go when it could be my moment to finally step out of the shadows? The revelation of my brother's affair replayed in my mind like a broken record, each detail sharper than the last. It wasn't just the fact that he had cheated, it was who he had cheated with. Someone so intertwined with our family that the betrayal stung even more. My brother, the shining beacon of morality in my father's eyes, wasn't just flawed, he was a hypocrite. At first, I tried to ignore it. I reminded myself of all the years I had suffered in silence, brushing aside their neglect and favoritism. After all, wasn't I better than this? Better than stooping to their level? But the thought of letting him continue to bask in undeserved glory while I remained invisible gnawed at me. I began piecing things together, looking for proof to confirm what I had overheard. The affair wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness, it was deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. There were late-night texts, secretive phone calls, and even a few poorly concealed meetings. The arrogance of it all enraged me. He hadn't even tried to cover his tracks, as if he were untouchable. The more I learned, the more I realized how much power I held. For the first time in my life, I had something my brother didn't: control over his carefully constructed image. The golden boy wasn't so golden after all. A plan began to take shape. It wasn't just about exposing him, it was about timing. If I did it too soon, it might blow over as a minor scandal. Too late, and the opportunity would slip through my fingers. No, it had to be at the wedding. The ultimate stage, with the largest audience. The idea felt monstrous at first, and I wrestled with my conscience. Was this who I wanted to be? Someone who tore down others to feel whole? But then I thought about all the times I'd been dismissed, overlooked, and ridiculed. For years, I had been a spectator in my own family, watching from the sidelines as they paraded their perfect lives. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming a part of myself. If they couldn't see me as an equal, they would remember me as a force to be reckoned with. So, I started preparing, gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The screenshots, the receipts, the damning details that would make his facade crumble. I would hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation, his pride, and the pedestal my father had placed him on. The wedding was fast approaching, and I could feel the tension building. Every time my brother flashed his smug grin, I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to confront him then and there. Patience, I told myself. The perfect moment was coming. A week before the wedding, as the house buzzed with last-minute preparations, I found myself in the one place no one ever bothered to look, the attic. The chaotic clutter of forgotten heirlooms and discarded memories made it the perfect escape. Up here, I could think without the constant hum of my father's praise for my brother echoing through the walls. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just some space to breathe. But as I sifted through boxes of old photos and broken trinkets, something caught my eye, a weathered leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked, the edges frayed, and it seemed out of place among the dusty relics. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up, flipping through its yellowed pages. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to my father. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like a collection of thoughts and musings, but it was enough to draw me in. At first, the entries were mundane. Notes about work, reminders for errands, and brief mentions of my brother's achievements. Then, as I turned the pages, the tone shifted. There were rants about my mother, about family obligations, and finally, about me. "I don't understand him," one entry began. "He's so different. Reserved, awkward. Sometimes, I think he's not even mine." The words hit me like a slap in the face. My chest tightened as I read on, each sentence cutting deeper. "I've tried to love him the same, but it's hard. He doesn't have Dan's charm, doesn't connect with people the way Dan does. I see so much of her in him." Her. He meant my mother, my biological mother. The woman who had passed away when I was just a baby. My father had remarried shortly after, and his new wife, Dan's mother, became the only maternal figure I'd ever known. But the entry didn't stop there. "Sometimes, I wonder if keeping him was a mistake. Maybe it would have been better if he'd gone with her family. He doesn't fit here. Never has." I dropped the diary, my hands trembling. My mind raced, trying to process the revelation. All my life, I had felt like an outsider, but I had chalked it up to favoritism, to the quirks of a dysfunctional family. I never imagined it went this deep. I wasn't just ignored or overlooked, I was resented. My very presence was an inconvenience, a reminder of a past my father wanted to forget. And yet, there it was, in black and white, proof that I had never truly been part of their world. A surge of anger coursed through me. The betrayal I felt wasn't just about my father's words, it was about everything that had followed. The years of neglect, the dismissive glances, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy that had plagued me my entire life. But as the anger bubbled, another thought crept in. Perhaps this truth, painful as it was, could be the final piece in my plan. Because now I knew something my brother didn't, a secret that would shake the foundation of his perfect little world. If my father had doubts about me, what else might he have hidden? The wedding wasn't just going to be my brother's downfall, it was going to be my reckoning. The diary burned in my hands like a live wire, and I couldn't put it down. Every word twisted the knife deeper into my psyche, but I couldn't stop reading. My mind was racing, a mix of hurt and fury, but also a strange exhilaration. This wasn't just a secret, it was a weapon. I flipped to the last few pages, desperate to uncover more. The entries grew more erratic, darker, almost unhinged. Then, I found it. The words jumped off the page, branding themselves into my mind. Dan doesn't know the truth about his mother. No one does. Not even her. But I do. My breath hitched. What truth? I read on, my pulse pounding in my ears. It's my fault. The affair, the lies. I thought it was buried, but sometimes, I wonder if he's really mine. The dates don't add up. If anyone ever found out. I froze. The golden child wasn't golden after all. The man my father had adored, pampered, and praised might not even be his son. The irony was so sharp I could taste it. But before I could process this revelation, a creak from behind startled me. I spun around, clutching the diary like a lifeline. The attic door was slightly ajar, a faint shadow moving just out of view. Someone had been there. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. No response. Heart hammering, I set the diary down and crept toward the door. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips as I gripped the edge of the frame and peeked out. The hallway was empty, but the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the stairs. Grabbing the diary, I bolted after the shadow. My footfalls thudded against the old wooden steps as I reached the bottom floor. The kitchen light was on, its glow spilling into the darkened living room. I stepped cautiously, the floor creaking under my weight. Then I saw him, Dan. He was standing by the counter, his back to me, his phone in hand. "You shouldn't snoop," I said, my voice icy. Dan jumped, spinning around. His usual cocky grin was gone, replaced by something between guilt and suspicion. "What are you talking about?" "You were in the attic," I accused, holding up the diary. His eyes darted to the book in my hands, and his expression darkened. "You've always been paranoid, you know that? Maybe that's why Dad can't stand you." I stepped closer, anger boiling over. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think you're the center of this family? The perfect son. You don't even know who you are." Dan's jaw tightened, his bravado cracking just slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" For a split second, I considered telling him everything, laying out the ugly truth right there. But I stopped myself. The wedding, his moment of glory, was the perfect stage for his humiliation. "Nothing," I said, forcing a smirk. "Just talking to myself. You're good at ignoring me, remember?" He stared at me, his fists clenched, before storming out of the kitchen. As the door slammed shut behind him, I leaned against the counter, clutching the diary like a lifeline. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anticipation. I had the truth. The question was, how far was I willing to go with it? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my room, poring over the diary and crafting a plan that would make them all remember me. Dan's betrayal, my father's lies, and the years of being treated like nothing, it all led to this moment. The wedding wasn't just a chance to expose my brother's affair. It was an opportunity to dismantle everything they held dear, one carefully planted truth at a time. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, as if the universe itself was mocking me. The house was alive with activity, caterers bustling in and out, my father barking orders, and Dan strutting around like royalty. I stayed out of sight, my heart pounding as the plan began to take shape. The diary sat hidden in my bag, along with printed copies of text messages I had gathered, messages between Dan and his mistress. The mistress was someone close, yes, but I hadn't yet revealed to Dan or my father just how close. That truth was going to be the grenade I threw at the perfect moment. I knew I had to be patient. Timing was everything. So, I played my part. I dressed in the suit my father had begrudgingly paid for and plastered on a fake smile. If anyone noticed the tension simmering beneath the surface, they didn't say a word. The wedding venue was a sprawling estate, with manicured gardens and rows of white chairs arranged beneath an archway of flowers. Guests arrived in droves, their laughter and chatter filling the air as they complimented the extravagance of it all. Dan and his bride-to-be, Sarah, looked picture-perfect, posing for photos with their sickeningly radiant smiles. I kept my distance, blending into the crowd like a shadow. Every time my father beamed with pride at Dan, my resolve hardened. They deserved this. They all deserved this. As the ceremony began, I took my seat in the back row. My hands trembled slightly, but I gripped my phone tightly, ready to set the plan in motion. The vows were painfully saccharine, filled with promises of eternal love and devotion. I nearly gagged. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers. Dan and Sarah kissed under the flowered arch, basking in the applause. It was all so perfect, too perfect. And that's when I knew it was time to shatter it. The reception was held in an opulent ballroom, with crystal chandeliers and tables adorned with extravagant floral arrangements. The air buzzed with champagne-fueled joy, but I moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd until I found her, the mistress. She stood near the bar, sipping a cocktail and laughing with a group of guests. Her name was Rachel, a family friend who had been close to us for years. She didn't see me approach until I was standing right beside her. "Having fun?" I asked, my voice low. Rachel stiffened, her smile faltering as she turned to face me. "What do you want?" I leaned in closer, just enough to make her uncomfortable. "I think you know. You've got two choices. Leave now and avoid what's coming, or stay and watch everything unravel." Her eyes widened, but she quickly masked her panic with defiance. "You wouldn't dare." I smiled, a cold, calculated smile. "Watch me." Rachel's glass trembled in her hand, but she said nothing. I turned and walked away, the thrill of control surging through me. Then, as the first speeches began, I made my way to the center of the room. My father was mid-toast, praising Dan for being the perfect son and Sarah for being a gift to the family. It was nauseating. I stepped up to the microphone as soon as he finished, clearing my throat. If I could have everyone's attention for a moment, I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. All eyes turned to me, the room falling silent. Dan's smug expression faltered for the first time, and my father's brow furrowed in confusion. "I think it's time we acknowledged some truths about this perfect day," I said, pulling the diary from my bag. "Because what's a wedding without a few family secrets?" The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier above. My father's face turned ashen, and Dan's forced smile froze, barely masking the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. "What are you doing?" Dan hissed through gritted teeth, stepping toward me. I raised my hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Relax, brother. This is your day, after all. It deserves a special touch, don't you think?" My voice dripped with sarcasm as I flipped open the diary. "I'd like to share something," I said, addressing the crowd, my tone measured but electric. "A little insight into what makes this family so unique." I began reading excerpts aloud. The diary's words hit the air like daggers, revealing my father's doubts about me, his favoritism, and his disdain for my very existence. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but I wasn't done yet. "And now, for the man of the hour," I said, my gaze locking onto Dan. "It turns out the golden child might not be so golden after all." Dan lunged forward, but I sidestepped him, holding up the printed messages I had prepared. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about loyalty. About commitment." Because while Dan was busy planning his dream wedding, he was also busy sneaking around with Rachel. I turned toward the bar where Rachel had been standing, but she was gone. The coward had fled, leaving Dan to face the fallout alone. Murmurs erupted among the guests, heads turning as whispers grew louder. Dan's bride, Sarah, stood frozen, her face pale, her bouquet trembling in her hands. "Don't listen to him," Dan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He's just jealous. He's trying to ruin everything." "Oh, I'm jealous, all right," I shot back. "Jealous of the lies you've gotten away with. Jealous of the way you've skated through life while I've been treated like nothing. But guess what, Dan? Your charmed life ends here." I handed the printed messages to Sarah, who stared at them with wide, tear-filled eyes. The room erupted into chaos as she read the damning texts, her lips trembling as the truth sank in. "You bastard," she whispered, her voice breaking. She threw the bouquet at Dan, the roses scattering across the floor as she stormed out of the room. Dan turned to me, his face contorted with rage. "You couldn't just let me have this, could you? You pathetic, bitter." Before he could finish, I cut him off. "Pathetic, bitter, maybe. But at least I'm not a liar. Or a cheater. Or the son of an affair." The crowd gasped again, louder this time. My father stood, his face a mask of horror. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. I held up the diary one last time, flipping to the incriminating page. "Right here, Dad. Your own words. The dates don't add up. Maybe Dan isn't even yours. Did you ever think about that while you were busy worshipping him?" Dan's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, scared even. My father stumbled back into his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. The ballroom was in pandemonium. Guests whispered, glared, and some even began to leave. My father sat frozen, staring at the floor as if it held answers. Dan stood paralyzed, his fists clenched but powerless. I took one last look around, letting the scene burn itself into my memory. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving the ruins of their perfect day behind me. For once, I was the one they couldn't ignore. The aftermath of the wedding fiasco was a surreal haze. In the days that followed, I expected apologies, explanations, or maybe even retaliation. But instead, I was met with an eerie silence. My father refused to answer my calls. Dan. Nowhere to be found. The entire family seemed to recoil, licking their wounds in private, too ashamed or enraged to confront me directly. But the silence had its own kind of gravity, pulling me toward the darker corners of our family's tangled web. It didn't take long for whispers to reach me, bits and pieces of rumors about things I'd never imagined were possible. The first bombshell came from an unlikely source, Aunt Margaret, the family gossip. She called me late one evening, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "You think your brother's the only one with skeletons in his closet," she said, practically cackling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, already bracing for whatever insanity was about to spill out. "Your uncle," she said, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know that sweet little farmhouse he's always bragging about? Turns out he's hiding something in the basement." It sounded ridiculous at first, like one of her usual exaggerations. But something about the way she described it, her voice trembling as if she was both thrilled and terrified, made me listen. "He and his wife have a daughter," she continued. "Not his wife's, though. His mistress's. And they keep her chained up, like some kind of animal." My stomach turned. "That's insane," I said, even as a cold shiver ran down my spine. "Check for yourself," she hissed before hanging up. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Could it be true? I thought about all the times we'd visited my uncle's house, the way he'd steered us away from certain rooms, the excuses he'd made about repairs or renovations that never seemed to happen. And then there was my brother. Dan wasn't just the golden child. He was the family enforcer, always quick to defend our father's honor or put someone in their place. But the whispers about his extracurricular activities painted a far darker picture. It started small. Stories of Dan showing up at people's houses, demanding money, making vague but menacing threats. Then came the accusations of violence. Broken noses, shattered windows, men disappearing for days after crossing him. But the most disturbing rumors surrounded his wife, Rachel. The same Rachel who had been his mistress, and later his wife, after Sarah left him humiliated and alone. She wasn't just a trophy for Dan, she was his ticket to influence. The rumors said she was far more than charming when it came to Dan's boss, Mr. Carlyle. "She keeps him happy," one neighbor had said, their voice tinged with disgust. "And not with her cooking, if you know what I mean." It was like peeling back layers of rot. The family I thought I knew was nothing more than a house of horrors, each secret more grotesque than the last. Determined to get answers, I drove to my uncle's farmhouse the next evening, the diary tucked under my arm like a talisman. The house loomed in the distance, its lights flickering faintly against the night sky. When I knocked, my uncle opened the door, his face ashen. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Don't listen to him," Dan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "He's just jealous. He's trying to ruin everything." "Oh, I'm jealous, all right," I shot back. "Jealous of the lies you've gotten away with. Jealous of the way you've skated through life while I've been treated like nothing. But guess what, Dan? Your charmed life ends here." I handed the printed messages to Sarah, who stared at them with wide, tear-filled eyes. The room erupted into chaos as she read the damning texts, her lips trembling as the truth sank in. "You bastard," she whispered, her voice breaking. She threw the bouquet at Dan, the roses scattering across the floor as she stormed out of the room. Dan turned to me, his face contorted with rage. "You couldn't just let me have this, could you? You pathetic, bitter." Before he could finish, I cut him off. "Pathetic, bitter, maybe. But at least I'm not a liar. Or a cheater. Or the son of an affair." The crowd gasped again, louder this time. My father stood, his face a mask of horror. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice trembling. I held up the diary one last time, flipping to the incriminating page. "Right here, Dad. Your own words. The dates don't add up. Maybe Dan isn't even yours. Did you ever think about that while you were busy worshipping him?" Dan's face drained of color. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, scared even. My father stumbled back into his chair, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. The ballroom was in pandemonium. Guests whispered, glared, and some even began to leave. My father sat frozen, staring at the floor as if it held answers. Dan stood paralyzed, his fists clenched but powerless. I took one last look around, letting the scene burn itself into my memory. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving the ruins of their perfect day behind me. For once, I was the one they couldn't ignore. The aftermath of the wedding fiasco was a surreal haze. In the days that followed, I expected apologies, explanations, or maybe even retaliation. But instead, I was met with an eerie silence. My father refused to answer my calls. Dan, Nowhere to be found. The entire family seemed to recoil, licking their wounds in private, too ashamed or enraged to confront me directly. But the silence had its own kind of gravity, pulling me toward the darker corners of our family's tangled web. It didn't take long for whispers to reach me, bits and pieces of rumors about things I'd never imagined were possible. The first bombshell came from an unlikely source, Aunt Margaret, the family gossip. She called me late one evening, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "You think your brother's the only one with skeletons in his closet," she said, practically cackling. "What are you talking about?" I asked, already bracing for whatever insanity was about to spill out. "Your uncle," she said, her tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know that sweet little farmhouse he's always bragging about? Turns out he's hiding something in the basement." It sounded ridiculous at first, like one of her usual exaggerations. But something about the way she described it, her voice trembling as if she was both thrilled and terrified, made me listen. "He and his wife have a daughter," she continued. "Not his wife's, though. His mistress's. And they keep her chained up, like some kind of animal." My stomach turned. "That's insane," I said, even as a cold shiver ran down my spine. "Check for yourself," she hissed before hanging up. I couldn't shake the image from my mind. Could it be true? I thought about all the times we'd visited my uncle's house, the way he'd steered us away from certain rooms, the excuses he'd made about repairs or renovations that never seemed to happen. And then there was my brother. Dan wasn't just the golden child. He was the family enforcer, always quick to defend our father's honor or put someone in their place. But the whispers about his extracurricular activities painted a far darker picture. It started small, stories of Dan showing up at people's houses, demanding money, making vague but menacing threats. Then came the accusations of violence. Broken noses, shattered windows, men disappearing for days after crossing him. But the most disturbing rumors surrounded his wife, Rachel. The same Rachel who had been his mistress, and later his wife, after Sarah left him humiliated and alone. She wasn't just a trophy for Dan, she was his ticket to influence. The rumors said she was far more than charming when it came to Dan's boss, Mr. Carlyle. "She keeps him happy," one neighbor had said, their voice tinged with disgust. "And not with her cooking, if you know what I mean." It was like peeling back layers of rot. The family I thought I knew was nothing more than a house of horrors, each secret more grotesque than the last. Determined to get answers, I drove to my uncle's farmhouse the next evening, the diary tucked under my arm like a talisman. The house loomed in the distance, its lights flickering faintly against the night sky. When I knocked, my uncle opened the door, his face ashen. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Just visiting," I said with a forced smile. "You know, catching up on all the family news." His eyes darted nervously, and he hesitated before letting me in. As I stepped inside, the smell hit me, damp and sour, like something rotting just out of sight. I made small talk, pretending to admire the knickknacks lining the shelves, but my ears strained for any sound, anything to confirm what I'd been told. And then I heard it, a faint, muffled cry, coming from below. My heart pounded as I turned to my uncle. "What's in the basement?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. His face darkened, and his hand tightened on the doorframe. "Storage," he said flatly. "Mind if I take a look?" Before he could answer, I moved toward the basement door. He lunged for me, but I was faster. Throwing the door open, I raced down the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps. At the bottom, the dim light revealed a scene that made my stomach churn. There, in the corner, was a girl, thin, pale, and chained to the wall. Her eyes widened in terror as I approached, and she shrank back as if expecting me to strike her. "What the hell is this?" I shouted, whirling to face my uncle, who had followed me down. He stared at me, his face a mask of rage and panic. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not what it looks like." "It looks like you're keeping your daughter prisoner," I snapped. "Is that not it?" But before he could answer, a noise from upstairs drew our attention. Heavy footsteps, followed by the unmistakable sound of Dan's voice. "Looks like we've got a family reunion," I muttered, my grip tightening on the diary. Whatever was happening in this family, I was done keeping quiet. The events of the evening clung to me like smoke, their weight oppressive even as I made my way out of the house. The basement scene was burned into my memory. The girl's hollow eyes, the clinking of the chain as she shifted, the seething lies my uncle had spit as he tried to justify the unjustifiable. The confrontation with Dan had been just as volatile. He'd stormed down to the basement, demanding to know what I was doing, his voice thick with menace. But for once, he wasn't in control. The disgust and horror radiating from my expression must have unnerved him. His usual bravado crumbled when I shoved the diary into his chest and hissed, "Read it. Then tell me how perfect you think your life is." The whole family had spiraled into chaos after that. Yelling, accusations, threats. It was a cacophony of rage and denial, and I wanted no part of it. As I stepped out into the crisp night air, the quiet was almost jarring. The stars were bright, the moon casting a silvery glow over the farmland. The house behind me, though, remained alive with its dark energy, raised voices spilling into the night like poison. I had parked my car on the far end of the property, where the driveway met the main road. As I reached for the door handle, I glanced back one last time. A single window on the lower floor caught my eye. Through it, I saw my uncle pouring a drink, his movements jerky and unsteady. He'd been drinking heavily since I arrived, his guilt barely masked by his blustering excuses. Something about the way he swayed toward the fireplace caught my attention. He held a wine bottle, tipping it far too carelessly as he tried to refill his glass. The deep red liquid splashed onto the floor, pooling dangerously close to the hearth's roaring flames. My stomach twisted. I opened my car door, ready to yell out, to warn him, or at least I thought I might. But then I stopped. I stood there, one hand on the door, the other gripping the roof of the car. A voice, low and dark, whispered in the back of my mind, "Why stop him? These people, their lies, their cruelty, their willingness to bury their sins and make others pay the price. They had built a house of cards, and it was crumbling. Maybe the fire was the spark they deserved." I didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't warn. I simply watched as the flames leapt higher, the flickering light spilling through the window. Moments later, the house erupted into chaos. Smoke poured from the windows, screams cutting through the night as the fire consumed everything in its path. Family members stumbled out one by one, coughing and gasping for air. My uncle, my father, Dan, they all spilled onto the lawn, their faces twisted in terror and confusion. I stayed by my car, a safe distance away, hidden in the shadows of the tree line. A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth as I watched them scramble. There was no saving the house. The fire had taken hold, burning too fast, too hot. By the time the fire trucks arrived, it was nothing more than a smoldering skeleton. I waited until the last flames died before I slipped into my car. The distant glow of the wreckage reflected in my rearview mirror as I drove away. For the first time in years, I felt light. As if a weight I'd been carrying forever had finally been lifted. Karma, they say, is a myth. A wishful thought. But as I watched that house burn, taking with it all the secrets and sins that had festered within, I knew better. Karma is real. And sometimes, it has a smile just like mine. The days after the fire passed in a blur of headlines and hushed conversations. Tragic accident claims family home, the papers called it. The cause was officially ruled as carelessness, spilled wine igniting near an open flame. My uncle's drunken stumble had finally caught up with him, taking more than just his dignity. There were no casualties, though the family's secrets lay buried under the rubble, reduced to ash like everything else. For me, the destruction was a kind of poetic justice, a cleansing flame that left them all stripped bare, with nothing but their own failures to cling to. My father, once a pillar of arrogance, seemed smaller when I saw him next. His voice, once booming with pride for Dan, had softened into mumbles of regret. My brother. He avoided me entirely, his gaze downcast whenever we crossed paths. Rachel had left him in the aftermath, unable to stomach the ruin her decisions had caused. And my uncle. He denied everything about the girl in the basement, claiming she was a troubled relative who needed discipline. But rumors spread faster than lies, and soon the police came knocking. His wife disappeared shortly after, leaving him to face the consequences alone. I should have felt vindicated. Maybe part of me did. But as the weeks passed, the fire became more than a physical event, it became a metaphor for everything I had endured. I had stood by and let it happen, knowing full well what might unfold. That knowledge sat with me, not as guilt, but as a kind of truth. I hadn't just exposed my family's secrets, I had let them destroy themselves. One evening, as I sat in my apartment flipping through the scorched remnants of the diary, I thought about karma. About whether it was truly an external force or simply the culmination of choices. The lesson I'd learned was a simple one. Betrayal breeds betrayal. Lies have a way of consuming the people who tell them. And the weight of secrets, when piled high enough, will eventually collapse under its own gravity. For years, I had been the outsider, the forgotten one, the shadow that lingered on the edges of their perfect lives. But now, I understood something they never did. Power lies not in being seen, but in knowing when to act. As I placed the charred diary back on the shelf, a faint smile crossed my lips. The family I once longed to be part of had crumbled, but I hadn't. They say karma doesn't exist, but I know better. Karma isn't just something that happens to you. It's the choices you make, the truths you unearth, and the fire you're willing to let burn. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's the justice you create for yourself.